Hello, thank you for joining the Health Effects Institute 2021 Annual Conference webinar series. My name is Pallavi Pant and I'm a senior scientist at HEI. I welcome all of you to this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to thank Eliane Van Vliet and Joanna Keel who helped co-organize today's session, and also all the hard work of our staff who helped make this webinar series possible. Today, we are going to be talking about an important topic, and we are very glad that Dr. Eloise Murray, Associate Professor at University College London and a member of HEI's Global Health Oversight Committee, and Dr. Jana Milford, Professor at University of Colorado Boulder and member of HEI Review Committee, have agreed to chair today's session. We are also very grateful for the speakers and panelists and audience members who are joining us from around the world. Before we begin, a quick set of housekeeping announcements. We've all heard these before, but as we go through the different talks, please make sure you're putting in any questions that you have for the speakers through the Q&A function. We will have about 5 minutes after each presenter completes their talk for quick questions, and then we will have a detailed Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you have any logistical difficulties, please feel free to contact us via the chat box. All of our webinars, including this one, are being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming weeks. And we hope that you can complete our post-webinar feedback survey, which will help us plan future events. We also have a series of webinars still to come, so please make sure you sign up for those on our website. Today, we are very excited to have a great set of speakers and panelists who will be talking about air quality related health impact and benefits assessments. And they will discuss both the approaches to conduct these types of analyses and also what the implications can be for countries, cities, as they try to formulate their air quality plans, interventions, and solutions. Now, I would like to pass this on to our chair, Dr. Eloise Murray, for a quick set of remarks.
Thanks, Pallavi. I'm not going to stand between you and the speakers for too long, but just to set up the session today. So we're all probably very familiar with the global impact of air pollution on health. It's one of the leading health risks, and depending on which resource you're accessing, the number of premature deaths is about 7 million from exposure to both outdoor and household air pollution. But of course, it's highly geographically variable. This is just from the GBD visualization tool, showing the rate of premature mortality for different countries, and then also sub-regions within each country, showing that the hotspots are quite familiar to us now. China and India show up, but on a rate basis, another portion of the world that shows up as having a large premature mortality is Western Europe. But of course, this is just a snapshot for 2019. It's just focusing on ambient fine particles, or PM2.5. But air pollution is dynamically changing. We're seeing air quality policy lead to improved air quality, but also rapid development in other locations leading to increased degradation in air quality. And of course, policymakers are particularly interested in the fine scale. So just for illustrative purposes, I've shown what we can achieve with the tools and resources that we have available for Ghana, for example, a country in West Africa that's growing rapidly, how we can start to obtain detailed information about the spatial distribution of the different sources that contribute to fine particles and other air pollution that has a direct impact on our health. And so our speakers today will take you through a journey on how we progress from a broad range of current and next generation air quality tools that we have available, and that will be covered by Davin Henze, how we can merge these tools for a detailed assessment of the sources and health burdens of air pollution, focusing specifically on the GBD MAPS project, which will be presented by Erin McDuffie, and then also how this information can be taken up by decision makers to develop policies that have the greatest societal benefit, and that'll be covered by Marcus Aman. So Pallavi already covered this, but just to reiterate that between each talk, we'll have a brief few minutes for a Q&A. So please post your Q&A in the box by clicking on the icon indicated on the slide. And then if your questions weren't covered during the talks, there is an opportunity during and after the panel discussion to have your questions addressed. And this will be moderated by Jana Milford and featuring the panel member, Cara D. Wright, who is from University of Pretoria in South Africa. And so before I hand over to our first speaker, Davin Henze, I'd just like to introduce you to him. So Dr. Davin Henze is a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. His research focuses on air quality, integrated environmental assessment tools, long-range pollution transport, and inverse modeling. Dr. Henze has received an EPA Early Career Award, a NASA New Investigator Award, is the lead scientist for the GeoSChem Adjunct model, and is also a member of the GeoSChem Steering Committee, the EPA Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, the NASA Earth Science Advisory Committee, and multiple NASA satellite science teams. Over to you, Davin.
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you all for inviting me to present. I'm starting off here with a picture of ozone and PM 2.5 from some model simulations in a paper by Larry Horowitz and co-authors from more than a decade ago. And this figure shows that the global distributions of these species. These are the species that really contribute to these large numbers, these several million premature deaths occurring globally that have really highlighted the issue of air quality on an international scale. And today I'll be talking about the models used to come up with these figures, as well as the models that we use for relating concentrations to health impacts, as well as emissions and policy decisions to health impacts, but focusing specifically on these two species, ozone and PM 2.5, in the discussion of air pollution. There we go. So how do we come up with these sorts of numbers like Eloise just showed, 4.14 premature deaths per year from PM 2.5? I want to talk a little bit today about how those sorts of numbers are calculated and the tools that we use to get there. There's several ingredients in coming up with those sorts of quantitative estimates. And there's three main ingredients, really. There's the concentration estimates themselves. And so like I showed on the previous figure, from a variety of sources, from models, from in situ measurements, from remote sensing data, we have some sense of what are the surface concentrations of PM 2.5 or ozone. And the surface concentrations are usually considered in a long-term average, annual average, or 3 to 6 month average for ozone, in terms of their relation to particular health impacts. The next set of ingredients is really the information about the people. Population data sets. These are often estimated or known at very high resolution, sort of kilometer scale. They're stratified in terms of age or other demographics. And along with total population, we have estimates of the mortality rates, so the incidence of people dying owing to particular health outcomes, respiratory illness, or cardiovascular illness. And then lastly, we have the concentration response function, which is the information coming from the epidemiological studies that shows us how we can quantitatively relate incidence of these various health impacts as a function of exposure to different magnitudes of pollutant concentrations. And so these are either analytic functions or statistical relationships that allow us to make these sorts of calculations. And I've just sort of made a little sketch of what one of these functions might look like. They're not terribly complicated, but they are controlled by a few parameters specifying the relative risk, as well as various thresholds or limits inherent in the analysis used to derive these functions. So these are the ingredients. How do we put them together? This is, I think, a little bit more of the recipe, the computational recipe for getting from some estimate or measure of concentration to a quantitative health impact. And again, focusing on health impact here being premature deaths owing to long-term exposure to these species. So the concentrations feed into this concentration response function, as well as the population and health data. The concentrations themselves are informed by a variety of pieces of information. Some of this information comes from models, some from in situ measurements, some from remote sensing, and some from geographical or geostatistical information. And so as I mentioned to start with, the ability of global models to simulate concentrations has really brought the air quality, health burden to the kind of forefront of the international health community attention in the past decade, perhaps more so than it was 2 decades ago, when earlier estimates of, say, the global burden of disease from PM were less than 1 million, because those estimates were based just on the urban areas where we had PM monitoring. With the use of models, and this is the first study to use models to estimate global burdens of disease for these species, the estimates all of a sudden jumped up to several million premature deaths, and this started to get a lot more attention from this community. In addition to models, as I have sort of mentioned earlier, there's remote sensing data that is used to inform these estimates of concentrations. And so again, starting a little more than a decade ago, people began to use satellite observations of aerosol optical depth and convert that aerosol optical depth to surface PM2.5 concentrations using modeling. And then these satellite-derived or satellite-based estimates of PM2.5 started to be used to estimate global burdens of disease. The first paper on this was from Evans et al. In 2013, now estimating 2.4 million premature deaths from total PM2.5. We could have an entire webinar just about how models are used to relate satellite data, raw satellite data, to the surface PM2.5 concentrations, but that's not really what I want to focus on in this talk as far as how models are used. But it's a good sort of thing to keep in mind, that models contribute to this part of the story as well. These days, the number that Eloise presented at the beginning of the talk, 4.14 premature deaths per year annually. These sorts of estimates come from a fusion of both the global model outputs, the satellite-derived information, geostatistical information, and in situ measurements. And so all of these data streams are fused together to create sort of best estimates of concentrations of both PM and ozone that feed into these global burden of disease numbers. So models play a big role in this estimation of concentrations and for this overall question of how do we get from concentration to a health impact. Expanding this flowchart, a lot of our questions take a step back and say, well, we're interested in not only the relationship between concentrations and health impacts, but the relationship between emissions and health impacts, because emissions are something that we have a lot more direct control over. Taking it, sort of thinking another step back, how do we control emissions? Well, we control them through various policies, either direct air quality policies or other sorts of energy policies that have residual impact on the emissions of air quality pollutants. And so along this entire computational flowchart, there are a range of modeling tools that we use. An example of this would be using an integrated assessment tool to go from a policy consideration, such as implementation of a vehicle emission standard, to a change in emissions. And from a change in emissions, we would then use an air quality model to map out the change in concentrations. And then we would perform these algebraic manipulations and computations, reading in the population health data to finally estimate health impacts. And an example of one set of tools that you might use for this would be to use the gains model for looking at how the activity of transportation responds to a particular policy, the eclipse model to allocate and distribute the emissions from transportations in time and space, geoschem, a chemical transport model to take those emissions and estimate a change in concentrations. And then you do all these number crunching yourself, or you call your good friend Susan Annenberg and she helps you do these calculations in order to estimate the health impacts. And this is what we might call the most rigorous calculation. It requires a wide range of expertise, ranging from knowledge of the statistics of the epidemiological studies to being able to run integrated assessment models. It requires some serious computational resources. The main sort of time sink in this whole process, the computational bottleneck is the middle piece here, relating emissions to concentrations. This often requires running calculations on a workstation or even a supercomputer. And the result is that, or the impact of that is that, this entire process can't be computed for many different policy considerations. Whereas, ideally, we would like to have this computational process be something that can be iterated quickly, maybe even set up in a feedback loop, so that health considerations can directly feed back into policy analysis, or health considerations can be used as a rapid screening of different policy considerations. And so in order to speed up this entire process, people have developed models to address different components of this entire sort of computational chain. So the rest of today, I'm going to talk about these components and what they do and where the strengths are. This is not an exhaustive list of all the different models that fit in this space. There are more comprehensive reviews of large numbers of tools, but I think this is sort of an illustrative sampling of the types of models that are used in this sort of analysis and the place that they have in this analysis space. So I want to focus first on the upper right corner, the tools that can help us map from concentrations to health impacts. So this is a set of tools that help users answer the following question: given some concentration distribution or a change to ambient concentrations, what are the health impacts associated with that? Two very widely used tools for answering that question are BenMap and AirQ Plus, developed and supported by the EPA and World Health Organizations, respectively. The concentrations may come from the output of a model. They may come from tabulated data. They may come from in situ measurements. In the example that I'm showing here from BenMap, the concentrations came from model simulations by CAMEX, so they were a gridded set of concentration estimates. These tools then estimate the associated health burden. And what's shown here in these figures is the premature deaths associated with PM2.5 and ozone associated with the pollution coming from the mobile sectors, and how that changes in 2011 versus 2025. So you can take a change in concentrations and map that to a change in health impacts. These tools, since that's sort of their overall scope, then have a lot of detail and options in terms of how this calculation can be done. They may consider not just the total premature deaths owing to long-term exposure. They may also have options for looking at acute exposure health impacts or other impacts like morbidity, or quantification of these impacts in terms of not just deaths, but the economic impacts of health considerations, as well as various options for considering concentration response functions. If you give these tools the exact same concentration inputs and the exact same population distributions and guide them to use the same concentration response function, they are fairly equivalent. And this paper here shows that they can get the same answer given the same settings and the same inputs. So when asked to evaluate the very same question, they will both provide very similar results. Here's BenMap on the left, AirQ Plus on the right, and just quick glancing at these columns, you see very similar numbers. Where the uncertainty in these sorts of analysis comes is not so much any one calculation, but the diversity of possible calculations you could do, or the range of inputs that you could provide to these sorts of tools. A way of looking at this is considering how the global burden of disease estimates for total premature deaths owing to ambient air pollution have changed over the year. You already saw a few different numbers show up in this presentation, from 2 million to 4 million. This study by Ostro et al. Looked at how these estimates have evolved in time as our estimates of changes in as our estimates of concentrations have evolved, or as our understanding of the concentration response functions have evolved. So when the Global Burden of Disease Project keeps the concentration response function the same, but just updates the concentration estimates, this has led to changes in the burden estimate of 8% or 12%. If they keep the concentration the same, but update the concentration response function approach in kind of an incremental way, this all of a sudden may lead to a 30% jump in the global burden. Any one of these estimates has also, errors. There should really be kind of whiskers on the top of each of these columns showing, typically plus or minus 30% uncertainty owing to the uncertainty in the epidemiological response function, as well as the health input data that goes into these. There are also sort of really kind of large game-changing considerations that are associated with considering very different concentration response functions. So not just an incremental change, but a completely different way of mapping out this relationship. So here I'm showing one commonly used function called the IER compared to a new function that was proposed in this paper from Burnett et al., the GEM model. And this led to differences in estimates of premature deaths of a factor of 2. So the choices here can make very large differences in our quantification of the impact of a set of concentrations on outcomes like premature deaths. Stepping back to this space of the computational flow chart, I next want to talk about tools that relate emissions to health impacts. So backing up from concentrations, how do we get from the part of this that's really adjustable at a policy level, the emissions? These other sets of tools involve a different set of uncertainties and approximations. Really, they're trying to get around the computational bottleneck of very expensive calculations that would be required to rigorously go from emissions to concentrations. And a lot of these tools have done those calculations for the user in advance and parameterized the results in some fashion. And so you have a variety of tools that are really suitable, are most suitable or most often used when what you're considering about the emissions or what you're considering about the health impacts falls in different sort of spatial or temporal scales. And here I'm going to highlight some of the ways that different tools are most commonly used. It's not necessarily the only way they're used, but it's sort of their kind of known strength. So if you start off by asking, well, what type of emissions are you considering? Are you considering a question related to emissions from a particular point source? You might want to use a tool like the easier tool, or emissions in a particular county. You might use various versions of the APEEP model, also referred to as APX. If you're looking at gridded emissions inventories that change owing to different estimates of historical emissions or future projections of emission scenarios, you can use tools like INMAP, FATE, FAST that take into account gridded species or sector resolved changes to emissions across really wide spatial scales. Then on the right side of this page is a distinction between what type of results you would like to get out of these tools. Would you just like to know what are the total impacts on premature deaths anywhere? You don't really care where those people are. You just want to know what are the avoided deaths. Tools like Easier can give you that. If you want to know where all are the premature deaths occurring, are these occurring in this part of the city versus that part of the city? Tools like INMAP that have very flexible spatial resolution in mapping out the response are quite valuable, and that would help with addressing questions related to environmental justice. Other tools provide their impacts on gridded, fixed grids at a variety of scales, maybe globally at a fixed grid, like the GBD Maps project, which we'll hear about. And then other tools have aggregated results either at the urban, county, or national scale. In addition, some of these tools are going to present not only premature deaths, but changes in the concentrations themselves, or they're going to monetize these sorts of health impacts in terms of the economic value that you would obtain per amount of emission change. So you see a lot of sort of dollars per ton type of results coming out of these tools. How do these tools compare? Well, at this step of the project, we're having to make some approximations to quickly relate emissions to concentrations. And unlike the comparison of BenMap to AirQ+, where given the exact same inputs, asked to do the exact same thing, you can get the same output. Here, we start to see a diversity of results. So what I'm showing here on the right are results from a report from IEC. I'm not going to hone in too much on the different tools, but there's different tools being shown in each sort of swath along this chart, and the different swaths correspond to different tests of different emissions perturbations applied to these tools. And then the range of numbers here are the ranges of these tools estimates compared to a rigorous calculation using a complete, detailed, high-resolution air quality model, in this case, CMAQ. So the ratios range from about 1/2 to 2. So these tools are getting the answer to within a factor of 2, for the most part. We also see that there is one set of emissions perturbations where the tools showed a much larger diversity of estimates. This was for a scenario looking at transportation emissions. This is triggering a lot of changes to emissions of NOx. The actual model response to this can be very nonlinear. These tools, on the other hand, for the most part, are linear estimates, and so they give you a much, maybe a more approximate estimate to these sorts of emissions changes. In contrast, another figure out of this report showed how the results changed when they looked at only the response of a primary elemental carbon. So this is a species that responds more linearly in the atmosphere, and the range of results was more narrow. Another way to see this is in a paper from Gilmore et al. In different columns showing estimates from different tools, in different rows showing the dollar per ton emitted response of different aerosol and aerosol precursors. And on the top row, again, you see that the primary PM2.5 results across these tools are rather similar compared to at the bottom, we have responses from NOx and ammonia. These trigger very nonlinear responses, and we're getting a kind of diversity of results. I think these sorts of studies that have standardized, some of the inputs and settings and done these cross comparisons are very useful for us to understand the robustness of these tools and some of the uncertainties. But also, it doesn't really highlight the strengths of any one of these tools and how they are best used. And so, in some contexts, it's nice to have this kind of apples to apples comparison. But I would also consider, let's try to use the tools in a more cohesive way and make something that's a little bit more of a nice fruit salad using the tools where they fit the best. Lastly, some of these tools, their scope goes all the way to looking at policy changes and how those impact emissions. These tools like LEAP IBC or Pathways, a tool that's in development, compile a lot of information about the current set of emissions, the current set of emissions controls that are in place. Some of these data sets in particular parts of the world or regions might be proprietary, some might be public, but a lot of work is required on the ground to assemble this. And then they can be used to ask questions like, if we have a certain carbon emission policy, can that be tweaked to also include reductions to emissions of short-lived climate pollutants like methane and black carbon? And if those were enacted either in one country or globally, what would be the co-benefits for air quality? And that's what are shown in this results figure here on the left, showing tens of thousands of premature deaths avoided when these control policies are designed with air quality co-benefits in mind. Okay. What's under the hood of all these? As I mentioned, actually doing these calculations rigorously could take hundreds to thousands of hours. And so these calculations are parameterizations of results of rigorous air quality models at different scales. The tools may include bias corrections owing to in situ data or remote sensing data. They're available in a variety of formats, either web-based, spreadsheets, scripts, software that you download. Some of these are open access, some are not. I'll provide this link if these slides are made available later to folks as far as how to access these tools, and wrap up with a summary just to say there's a wide range of tools available across scales. They differ in the types of inputs, as well as the resolution of these inputs and the resolution of the results that you get. Some of the largest uncertainties in these calculations are owing to our selection of the concentration response function, as well as the approximations made in relating emissions to concentrations. I think I'll end there and we'll take questions maybe now or if not now during the panel conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan, for a really great overview of the range of tools that are available. Unfortunately, we are out of time to take questions now, but I know there are a number of questions that have been posed to you, so we will cover them later in the session. So Erin, if you want to share your screen, just so that we have that ready to go. Our next speaker is Erin McDuffie. So Dr. Erin McDuffie is an atmospheric scientist whose academic work has combined field measurements, computational models, and interdisciplinary collaborations to study sources of air pollution and its impact on human health. Dr. McDuffie received her PhD in atmospheric chemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder. She then made the switch to global modeling and air quality impacts for a postdoctoral fellowship and is currently a visiting research associate at Washington University in St. Louis and a AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellow hosted at the US EPA. Dr. McDuffie also pledges her time to communicate science and diversify STEM through outreach and mentoring. Over to you, Erin.
Great. Thank you so much, Eloise. And thank you to the HEI for inviting me to give this talk today. So mine is going to be a bit more of a traditional research talk, but Davin did a great job of queuing up what I'll be speaking about today. So in this work, it was funded by the HEI, and so we've conducted this work over the last 2 years, and we were using more of these quote rigorous modeling methods that Davin was describing earlier in order to study source contributions to ambient fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, and its attributable mortality across multiple spatial scales. So before I get started, I do want to thank many of my co-authors and collaborators here, particularly Michael Brower and Randall Martin, who were both the PIs on this project, and then many folks at various institutions that contributed to the emissions, modeling, and exposure and impacts analyses that I'll be discussing today. So the main motivation of this work largely stems from what we heard about in Davin's talk, where ambient fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, is found at elevated concentrations around the world, and exposure to this to PM 2.5 leads to around 4 million deaths, at least in recent years. And so if we want to conduct research where we ultimately try to reduce or determine ways that we can reduce the number of deaths that are occurring worldwide, we need to ultimately reduce the number of the concentration of PM 2.5. And in order to do that, we need to really identify where it's coming from. But at least on the global scale, this is a really hard problem to solve, because PM 2.5 is not just one thing. It's made up of all of these different atmospheric chemical components. And many of these are both directly emitted from various sources at the surface, but many are also formed from chemical reactions that happen in the atmosphere between emissions that occur from a wide variety of sources. And so measurements of PM 2.5 mass and its chemical composition, those can be very useful in order to try to get a sense for where this mass is coming from. So for example, depending on the relative amounts of these different chemical components, that gives you a sense of where this mass might originate from. However, long-term measurements of annual average concentrations are not available in the majority of countries worldwide. So this is a figure from one of Randall Martin's recent papers, where he's showing that 60% of all countries, which are all of these grayed out countries on this map, these don't have a single long-term monitor for ambient PM 2.5 on the surface. So if the goal of our study is to, again, try to determine ways to reduce ambient mortality or attributable mortality and reduce PM 2.5 concentrations, identify dominant sources. In order to do that on the global scale, we need to turn to other methods besides just ambient observations. So that kind of gives you a context for this work. And to back up for a moment, the specific study that I'll be talking about today is part of the HEI-funded Global Burden of Disease Major Air Pollution Sources Project, or GBD MAPS for short. And again, the goal of this particular project is to identify major sources of ambient PM 2.5 and its attributable disease burden for 204 countries around the world. Now, the way we're doing this in light of limited ambient observations is that we're using an integrated modeling approach, very similar to what Davin described in his previous talk. So we're using a combination of an emissions inventory with a global chemical transport model, GeoSchem, in order to conduct a series of sensitivity simulations to identify where this mass is coming from. Then to quantify the contribution of these various sources to both the absolute mass of PM 2.5 and its disease burden, we're integrating our sensitivity simulations with high resolution exposure estimates and then concentration response relationships from the GBD. So I'll get into more of the details of this method and some of the intermediate results in a moment, but I did want to highlight that we are definitely not the first ones to use this general approach to study sources of PM 2.5 on the global scale. So here are some results from just 2 previous studies in this space. So again, showing the fractional contribution of various sources to PM 2.5. And the reason that I'm showing this is not only to highlight that we're not the first ones to do this type of study, but I think point out 2 key points that kind of separate what's been done in the past to what we're trying to do with GBD MAPS Global. So the first, I think, just by the nature of the fact that these papers were published a few years ago, they're using simulations that at this point are fairly dated. And so the emissions that are used in these simulations may not reflect the ambient chemical concentrations that we have or that we're observing in the atmosphere today, particularly because there are regions like China which have implemented policies that have drastically reduced their air pollution emissions. And then second, you'll note that both of these studies kind of test the contributions of rather aggregate sectors. And so I think it's important to note that the policy relevance of these types of global studies, the policy relevance increases as you provide information on more detailed source sectors, particularly the addition of fuel type information. And then, as I noted, studying contributions from contemporary estimates of emissions provides more policy relevance. And then also providing these types of results at multiple spatial scales, because sources of PM 2.5 can vary drastically at the subnational level. So all of these aspects we were attempting to address directly through the GBD Maps Global project. So going back to our general methodology overview, I'm going to now spend the next few minutes talking about each one of these steps in a little bit more detail and providing some intermediate results. So I want to start back at the very beginning with the emissions inventory and the modeling work, and really highlight the point that these types of studies, they're really only as good as the emission inventories and the models that they're using. And so when we started this work back in the fall of 2018, at that point in time, there was not a global gridded air pollutant emissions inventory that publicly provided emissions with contemporary estimates, or as contemporary estimates as we wanted, and they didn't publicly provide the detailed source categories and fuel type contributions that we wanted to work with in our study. And so I ended up collaborating with the developers of the Community Emissions Data System, or CEDS. So this was developed out of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and University of Maryland. And so I worked with these developers to provide or publish an updated version of the CEDS inventory that provides gridded anthropogenic emissions from 1970 all the way up through 2017 for 7 key atmospheric pollutants and PM 2.5 precursors from a variety of emission sectors. And so I'm showing here the global total emissions of each one of these different atmospheric pollutants, and the total global emissions are colored by their contributions from various sources. So you can see, for example, these sources range all the way from agriculture to energy generation in the light green to waste in this orange and residential energy use in the light blue. Now, a key aspect of this work, as I previously noted, was the availability of fuel type information. So we were also able to produce those results from this emissions inventory. And so now I'm showing the same global emissions, but instead of colored by source sector, I'm now coloring the total emissions by fuel type contribution. So sorry if this is small, but you can see that, for example, again, for ammonia, process or non-combustion emissions are a large source of ammonia and non-methane VOCs. Dominant sources of NOx are actually oil and natural gas combustion. Coal combustion is a dominant source of SO2 throughout the entire time series. And then organic carbon and black carbon have large sources from solid biofuel or biomass combustion. And because we have these emissions spatially disaggregated, we can also look at emission trends in terms of different regions around the world. And so this is what I'm quickly showing here, just to highlight a point that I made earlier, that there are particular countries or regions around the world, like China, for example, which are all of the red curves in these figures, where they've introduced policies that have drastically reduced their emissions of particular air pollutants over recent years. And so this just, again, highlights that if you're doing this type of study and you're using an inventory that's maybe 5+ years old, that inventory is likely not going to reflect the chemical conditions of the atmosphere today. So we ended up using this emissions inventory as an input into the GeosChem 3D chemical transport model. And this model was originally developed out of Harvard and uses assimilated meteorology and these anthropogenic emissions as input in order to simulate and model all of these basic atmospheric processes in order to calculate local concentrations of different atmospheric components, including all of the components of PM 2.5. So we ended up using these tools, as I mentioned earlier, to run a series of sensitivity simulations. And so exactly what that means is that we ran 25 simulations where in each one we completely eliminated one emission source. So for example, what I'm showing here are results from coal use in the energy sector. So we removed all of those emissions worldwide, looked at or calculated the amount of PM 2.5 that was formed in that simulation, compared it to the amount of PM 2.5 that was formed in the base simulation where all sources of emissions were present. And that gives us a sense for how much PM 2.5 is produced from that particular source. For our study, looking at 25 different sources of PM 2.5, this ended up requiring 100 individual 13-month model simulations, which in the end, I think took about 2 months of real time to run on our cluster. So very computationally intensive. But once we had the full set of simulation results, we were able to calculate the fractional or relative contributions of all of these different sources to PM 2.5. And we can do this at the global scale, like I'm showing here in this example, all the way down to the national and subnational scales. So diving into a few of these model results quickly before I move on. I wanted to show you first just a snapshot of what the dominant sources of PM 2.5 look like on the global scale. So you can see here from this pie chart that residential energy use is the largest source of PM 2.5. Also industrial processes, energy generation, and windblown dust are other dominant sources. Of course, we can also look at these source contributions now not in terms of source sectors, but in terms of different fuel types. And so here, this pie chart is now showing that solid biomass, total coal, and liquid oil and natural gas combined contribute to about half of the PM 2.5 worldwide. And then if you just separate the fossil fuel combustion contributions, so coal and oil and gas, those contribute to about 27%. So I noted at the very beginning that the policy relevance of these types of studies increases as you provide more detailed information. And so I just wanted to give you 2 examples of that from our study very quickly. So first, I'm showing a map here where each country is colored by the type of fuel that contributed the most to PM 2.5 in that country. So for example, we can see that regions throughout South Africa, Eastern and Central Europe, as well as parts of Asia, these all had, or these coal combustion was the dominant source of PM 2.5 in these countries relative to the other fuel types. Now in 2017, coal combustion or coal use is primarily found in the energy generation and industrial sectors. And so we ended up running additional simulations where we tested coal use in just those 2 sectors. And so those results are what I'm showing here in these 2 maps now, where you can see that, for example, in China, the relative contribution of coal use for industrial processes is larger than the contribution from coal use in energy generation. And then the exact opposite is actually true for regions in South Africa and again, throughout Central and Eastern Europe, where you actually have larger contributions from coal use in energy generation relative to coal use for industrial processes. So this type of information can help countries potentially prioritize reduction efforts by providing these more detailed combined source fuel category results. As one final example, I also noted at the beginning that providing source contribution results across multiple spatial scales can, again, provide increased policy relevant information. So here I'm showing kind of a similar map to the last slide, but now I'm showing instead of showing averages over country, I'm showing the source that is the dominant source sector of PM 2.5 in each of the model grid cells. So if we zoom in on the US, for example, we can see that in the Western US, wildfires are the dominant source of PM 2.5 in 2017. according to our simulations. But as you move east, you start having on-road transportation, energy generation, and agriculture becoming dominant sources in those regions. So again, because sources of PM 2.5 can vary at the subnational scales, these types of results can help prioritize reduction efforts. Okay, so hopefully those results kind of gave you a sense for the type of information that's provided by the emission sensitivity simulations, and then the type of information that went into those analyses. But the next step is to actually quantify the contributions of these sources to both total PM 2.5 mass and the attributable burden. So for that first step, we're actually using high resolution exposure estimates from satellite-derived PM 2.5 concentration estimates that are used both in the GBD and then downscaled using 1 by 1 kilometer estimates from Melanie Hammer's most recent paper out of Randall Martin's group. So these high resolution exposure estimates, and again, this is when all sources, we're considering all sources contributing to these estimates, using these high resolution estimates, we were able to calculate that the annual population weighted average PM 2.5 concentration in 2017 is around 42 micrograms per meter cubed. And just to give you a point of reference, this is about 4 times higher than the World Health Organization guidelines, which are set at 10 micrograms per meter cubed. So we then combine these high resolution exposure estimates with some of these concentration response relationships like Davin was talking about in his talk previously. So the way we actually calculate the disease burden, just outlined very generally here, I'll go through this quickly. We're using baseline mortality data from the GBD. So this is essentially the total number of deaths that are occurring in each country as a function of these 6 different diseases. And we are then scaling those total number of deaths by the fraction that can actually be attributable to long-term PM 2.5 exposure. And this population attributable fraction is a function of the relative risk given a particular level of exposure. And these come from these concentration response relationships. So just to give you one example, relative to a very low level of exposure, say on average you're exposed to 60 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5 on an annual basis. That means that you have about a 1.5 times higher relative risk of developing and dying from COPD and ischemic heart disease than you would at this relatively low or no exposure level. So we combine these high resolution exposure estimates with these concentration response relationships to provide an updated estimate of the total number of attributable deaths in 2017 from all sources of PM 2.5. So that is, those results are what I'm showing here in this map. So this is essentially an updated version of the map that I showed you on slide 1. So each country here is colored by the total number of deaths attributable to ambient PM 2.5 in that country based on our study. But if we want to get back to our original question of what are the sources leading to these levels of mortality, this is where we can combine these burden results with our source sensitivity simulations. So here I'm showing the results again for the global average. I already showed you these first 2 pie charts before. This pie chart is now showing the contribution from these various diseases. But we can see, for example, or just as a reminder, that residential energy and windblown dust are large sources of PM 2.5 mass and attributable mortality. If we look at fossil fuel contributions specifically, as a reminder, these contributed to 27%. And now when you apply that to our estimates of the total attributable burden, we can calculate or estimate that fossil fuel combustion actually leads to about 1 million deaths worldwide in 2017. Now, these types of results, we not only have these results at the global scale, but we have them for all world countries. And so I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of the type of information we have in the study. So I'm going to show you these same results for the top 9 countries with the highest attributable disease burdens. So on this map, India and China really pop out. And so you can see that their total number of attributable deaths are listed here. I think what's really interesting about combining now with these source sensitivity simulations is that you can start directly comparing sources across countries. And so you can see that, for example, total coal and waste sources are actually larger contributors to PM 2.5 and attributable mortality in China than residential energy use, largely from biofuel combustion in India. And so then if we look at the remaining top 9 countries, those include Pakistan, Egypt and Indonesia, as well as Bangladesh, Nigeria, and then the United States that comes in at number 9. So there is a lot of information on this slide, and I'm not expecting for you to take it all in right now. This just shows an example of the wealth of information that's provided in this type of rigorous analysis. And as I mentioned before, allows you to start comparing and contrasting sources across countries. So just as one final example, in the US, we have a much larger contribution from on-road transportation and liquid oil and natural gas combustion than many of these other top countries, particularly when you compare with more arid regions like Nigeria and Egypt, where they have this very large contribution from windblown dust. So I now want to end by noting again that we are not the first ones to conduct this type of study. And in the manuscript that we've prepared and the report for HEI, which will be forthcoming soon, we did a rigorous comparison with all of these different previous studies at both the global scale and the national scale. And instead of going through those results, I just kind of wanted to emphasize here instead that it is really difficult to quantitatively compare results across all of these different studies, even if they're using generally the same approach that I'm showing here. Because if we look back at our general methodology overview, even if you're using the same approach, there are essentially differences in every one of these steps that lead to large differences in the final quantitative values. And so, for example, you can use different emission inventories, different models, different exposure estimates, and differences in these concentration response relationships drives a lot of the differences between these types of studies. And so I think it's really important that as a community, as we're starting to kind of grapple with these differences and try to reduce these discrepancies, it's really vital that these types of studies are done in a transparent way, and that they provide the input data and results in a public format, and that the methods are documented appropriately. And so to that end, we made a point of doing just that with our study. We have made all of the assets of the study publicly available, from our input data sets to our analysis scripts to the results. Many of these are publicly available right now, but all will be released once the final manuscript is published. And then we've also produced or developed a public data visualization site to help you interact with the data without having to download the entire data set yourself. So then to end, I know I've gone long, so I'll just leave my conclusions up here, but I think it's important to note that even though there are differences in many of the studies that quantify the attributable disease burden of PM2.5, I don't want us to get bogged down too much in the details, because I think we do have enough information to start taking action now. All of these studies have found that anthropogenic sources of emissions contribute to PM2.5 formation, particularly from fossil fuel combustion. And so even if some of these studies estimate fossil fuel contributions of 1 million or maybe 9 million deaths, there's still that association there. And so that we still have generally enough information to take action now to lead to a healthier population and planet. So with that, I will take any questions or wait till the panel discussion. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Erin. There's certainly a lot of interest in your presentation and a lot of questions, but we do unfortunately need to move on to the third speaker. But again, keep posting your questions in the Q&A box and we'll be able to address them later in the session. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marcus Aman. So Dr. Aman is at the IIASA, and he has decades of experience in policy analyses on cost-effective emission control strategies for clean air and climate policy proposals, and has also led the development of integrated assessment models for the control of greenhouse gas emissions as well as air pollution. He's worked closely with the European Commission and the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution. He also serves on several advisory panels, including the Science Advisory Panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And he received his PhD from the University of Karlsruhe in Germany and has a background in engineering and economics. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you. Now, since time is short, I want to say a few words about how the health impact assessment is feeding into the policymaking process, very importantly. and how the specific information enhances a knowledge base for air quality management. And since time is short, I want to focus on two specific aspects. First one, a clear message coming out from all the health impact assessment methods on how to make air quality management more effective. And the second one, I want to mention a caveat which emerges from the current methodological uncertainties, which should be considered when we use information from health impact assessment for policy making. So let me start with a general statement that I think it has mentioned before, that the global burden of disease study with highlighting the magnitude of the health impact and the burden of disease from air pollution was really a game changer and has raised a lot of public attention and also attention among policymakers about the importance of taking action to clean up the air. The question is now, beyond the general awareness about the severity of the issue, how can health impact assessment help to design more effective policies? And let me briefly summarize how the circle of air quality management is frequently happening. So you have seen similar graph before. So in principle, we conceptually understand that look at the sources of pollution, right, from the emission generating activities, consider the emission controls, then it comes out in emission inventories. And from the emission inventories, there are models to compute ambient air concentrations. And this has been, the tools for this have been explained by David a lot before. Now, this is quite important, and the air quality management traditionally was addressing emission generating activities, so economic activities, and specific emission controls. And traditionally, these decisions on how to take actions, how to prioritize action, was often driven by power games, political influence, and other factors, not very systematically, not very knowledge-based. One refinement emerged already when the cost component, economic dimension was included. So it was then possible to quantify the costs of different emission control strategies, which adds already an important dimension to the policy making. And these concentrations, air quality levels, together with costs, help to enhance the effectiveness of policies. But now, with the global burden of disease and with the emergence of the health impact assessment methodologies, we could go a step further. So, as was explained before, from the ambient concentrations, one could go compute the population exposure, and then on the health impacts. And this, of course, provides much more power to this design of policies. And the traditional economic textbook approach for using this information in a most systematic way is to go through a cost-benefit analysis, which starts from the health impacts, quantifies the monetary benefits from this, and then these monetary benefits can be balanced against the cost of emission controls. And according to economic theory, the optimal point is then, optimal intervention level is then reached when the marginal costs of emission controls are equalized to the marginal benefits. That's very nice and very attractive from a theoretical perspective. However, in practice, we find that there are some issues, some aspects which impede somehow the acceptance of such a cost-benefit analysis. And there are major contentious issues, uncertainties, but there are also ideological issues in terms of quantifying the health impacts. For a long time, this health impact assessment was based on evidence gained in the Western world. There was a question raised by many countries to what extent these estimates are applicable and valid for the developing countries. And even more so, there's even more controversy about the monetization of health benefits, because it involves the question of what is the economic value of human life and of people. And the general approach that the value of a life is proportional to the income levels is also not generally shared. So although this cost-benefit analysis is a conceptually and theoretically attractive concept, in practice, these issues and the debate about quantification of health impacts and especially the monetization of health benefits emerged as a stumblestone. However, in the meantime, in practice, in many parts of the world, there has an alternative path has emerged, which is conducting a cost-effectiveness analysis, which somehow avoids these contentious issues. Because a cost-effectiveness analysis essentially starts with certain targets, which are determined by policymakers. And then the analysis explores which of the available policy options would deliver these targets in the least cost. And these targets could now be specified either in terms of ambient concentrations. This was for a long time the case. We have this uniform ambient air quality standards throughout the world. It could go a step further, also in terms of enhancing the economic efficiency by considering the population exposure. So it's not the peak exposure in a region, but to what extent the total exposure of the total population is affected. Or if the health impact methods are accepted in a region, in a country, then also one could aim at reducing health impacts at least costs. In all cases, so this is a major progress compared to this uninformed ad hoc decision making based on important information, and the health impact assessment has a very important role to play in all situations here in order to enhance the effectiveness of the policies. Now, I want to address the focus of two specific aspects. The one is an important finding is that whatever the methodologies of the health impact assessment are, but all of them clearly highlight that the current or the traditional air quality management approaches, which are focusing on bringing air concentrations everywhere in an area below an uniform air quality standard, in principle establishing or putting caps on concentrations, that these are rather ineffective, and it would be a much more cost-effective way forward with much higher economic efficiencies and much higher health benefits if one would focus on the population exposure instead of this. And as an illustration, I want to show you a sneak preview on the outcomes of a study which will be released in a few months, conducted by the World Bank on the air quality management approaches for South Asia. And for this study, the GAINS model was used to explore 4 alternative different strategies for reducing emissions and improving air quality. First one is this conventional ad hoc selection of measures. So this was a kind of an inventory of the most popular measures in the region. The second approach would be to aim that in all areas throughout South Asia, the concentration, PM2.5 concentrations would be brought below the WHO interim target number 1, below 35 micrograms, but no other targets for lower concentrations. So they're essentially focusing on this most polluted hotspot areas and do everything to bring the concentrations there below 35 micrograms, but not trigger action in regions outside of, also in cleaner areas. The third option would be to reduce population exposure at least cost. And the fourth option is to, as for comparison, what would it cost if all the technically possible measures would be taken? And there are very important, interesting insights here. So this table summarizes the health impacts, which are quantified using the global burden of disease method. How many deaths would be avoided in the different cases. The first is this ad hoc selection of measures, 270,000 cases of deaths. And what are the costs per life saved? So ad hoc selection delivers about 270,000 cases. if bringing concentrations everywhere in South Asia below this 35 micrograms would increase this to more than 700,000 cases, or the avoided deaths. If one would more or less take the same efforts, but focus them not on the hotspots, but there where the population exposure is reduced most, then more or less the same amount. And the maximum feasible measures would more or less double the option. But the most interesting aspect are the costs associated with this. So in terms of cost per life saved, is of course the maximum feasible measures are the most expensive ones. The ad hoc selection is also pretty expensive. Focusing measures only to the areas, to the hotspots, saves a lot, already some money. But most strikingly, if one focuses on the population exposure reduction and taking all the actions which deliver the largest reduction in population exposures at least costs, cuts the costs significantly by a factor of 3 or 4 compared to the peak concentration. So the main reason for this is that focusing on population exposure is not only looking at the hotspots and not only taking very expensive measures at the hotspots, extreme measures at the hotspots, but harvest also the cheap reductions, population exposure reduction at less polluted places, lower concentrations, and we know that the thresholds for health impacts are very, very low. So and we can gain quite significant health impacts by also improving concentrations below the uniform limit values. And this feature does not only hold for South Asia, but we have could show you similar findings for the Europe, for example, where policies which are only driven by capping the hotspots are much, much more expensive and deliver less health impacts than measures where one goes for the least, for looking at the total population exposure. And I think that's independent of the health impact methodology. That's a very important message, because still in many countries of the world, policy is currently focusing only at these peak concentrations, and this has a kind of blind spot at the lower concentrations, where we still see very large health impacts. And the second point I want to mention is a kind of a caveat that the health impact, the benefits, or at least the estimated health benefits from the policy interventions are very sensitive towards the assumed shape of the exposure response functions. So we have heard before, there are different shapes of the exposure response functions, very popular, and what is used in the GBD are the supralinear curves, which are flattening off at the higher concentrations. There's a good rationales behind this. But there are very important implications, and there was a lot of debate whether these concentrations apply, or whether these functions apply in areas which have a lot of very high concentrations, mainly also from anthropogenic sources like China and India. But I want to highlight today one aspect for those areas where we have very high concentrations of natural source originating from natural sources. And this is a graph which in total is similar to the figures you have seen before. This is the global maps of PM2.5 concentrations. And you see on the left side the concentrations originating from the natural sources, soil dust. And you see this very high concentrations in some areas. And then at the same scale, the PM2.5 concentrations from human activities. And you see in some areas, the natural sources are dominating the anthropogenic contributions by far. And unfortunately, if one assumes a supralinear curve on total exposure response curve, then if one assumes the PM2.5, the human activity sitting on top of the natural sources, sometimes the feedback or the benefits from doing something or reducing the concentrations from anthropogenic activities is rather small. And just an illustration, this is a study which will be published by the World Bank on the natural natural capital index for air quality. This is for Saudi Arabia, population exposure. 2018, the brown bar indicates the share of natural sources, soil dust in this area. And the blue bar from the dark blue from Saudi Arabia itself and the light blue from other countries. This share, the third column shows how much the mitigation potential from sources in anthropogenic sources in Saudi Arabia is. So it's not significant, it's only a small share compared to the total concentration, because the total exposure is really dominated by natural sources. And the right side shows you the estimated health impacts for these three different cases. So between 2018 and 2030, you have a significant increase, and this is mainly related to the expected population increase in the country. But then you see only a very minor scope for reducing the health impact from air pollution from the anthropogenic sources, which is on one hand, of course, caused by the fact that the anthropogenic sources make only limited contribution a priori to the concentration. But the other dominating effect here is that these anthropogenic sources are, if you do something, you still have very high concentrations, and in the flat curve, the flat part of the integrated exposure response curve, you get a very small impact. So looking at this, one has to, at least the current method, the GBD method, would suggest only very minor health benefits from taking serious action on anthropogenic emissions in the country. But of course, there are now alternative concepts here on alternative methods for quantifying health impacts, which might come out with different results. And given this situation, this uncertainty, I would call for caution for using health impact assessment as a very strict quantitative guidance for constructing or designing emission population air quality management policies. So in summary, just three main conclusions. I think there was a major achievement that this health impact assessment over the last decade was very critical for revealing and highlighting the health burden from poor air quality. And that's really a major step forward compared to the situation we were 10 years ago. I think very important message with very far-reaching implications on the current, even the legal air quality frameworks emerges from the fact that the economic efficiency of policies or the strategies which are focusing on reducing the overall population exposure are much more economically efficient than the conventional approaches which aim at capping concentrations at uniform ambient air quality standards. This is really important, would call for a complete rethinking of air quality management approaches. And finally, just repeating this, my reservation or my caution against for using the health impact methods for precise quantitative guidance for the design of air quality management due to some of the uncertainties which are not completely resolved. And this I want to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for that insightful presentation. Really appreciate your laying out for us the ways that air pollution decision-making has traditionally been conducted, and the ways that health impact assessment could fit into that framework and expand on it. So we're going to turn now to a panel discussion, and I think Marcus set us up for this really well with his summary of really our whole webinar today, which is thinking about the question of how we move beyond informing policymakers about the significance of the global burden of disease from air pollution to using these new tools more productively for policy design. So I want to start by introducing our additional panel member, Dr. Cara D. Wright. Dr. Charity Wright is a specialist scientist at the South African Medical Research Council, leading the Climate and Health Research Program. She's also extraordinary lecturer at the University of Pretoria. She holds a PhD in public health from the University of Otago and a master's in geography and environmental management from the University of Natal. Her research focuses on environmental health in Africa, including personal solar ultraviolet radiation exposure and skin cancer prevention, personal dosimetry, health risk assessment, and air pollution-related disease measurement and prevention. Dr. Wright is a member of the South African Young Academy of Science, co-editor of the Clean Air Journal, and founder of the Environmental Health Research Network. So Dr. Wright, welcome to our conversation. And I'm going to start off our panel with a question to you. Could you talk a little bit about your observations of how policymakers evaluate options for guiding decisions about pollution control strategies? What's the importance of and availability of data versus models? And how do you see health impact assessments like the ones we're discussing today coming into that picture?
Sure. Thank you very much first for the introduction and for having me here today. It's wonderful to see such great attendance for this webinar. And thank you for the 3 excellent presentations, which some were really complicated and I had to concentrate very hard. But to answer your point, I think we've got to make a very big jump between the complexity that we saw today to get it into the hands of policymakers and decision makers so that they can make meaningful and educated decisions. It's certainly not the case that you can show somebody modeled data, try and give an explanation of what the model means, and they're going to just say, okay, well, therefore we're going to decide to do A, B, and C because you've showed us these results. I think there has to be trust, and that was something certainly that came across for me in all of the presentations. In fact, Erin spoke very much about the word collaboration and teamwork. And in the case of my country, where we don't have a lot of ground-based monitoring stations, if we are to rely on satellite data, which we can obviously access, we would want to collaborate with others who have experience in that area. It's the same where looking at all those incredible models that are used to get us to understand not only concentrations, but actual health impacts. When you sit down with, say, our National Air Quality Officer in South Africa, the questions will be, where does this concentration response function come from? And that was mentioned today. So unless you've got some form of, I'd like to use the term local buy-in, if that's the right word. It's very difficult to convince from global to local, which is the topic today, to happen smoothly. And I can give an example where, just very, very briefly, I'm working with the Burden of Disease Research Unit at the Medical Research Council. We've been working closely with Michael Brouwer to look at the burden of disease from household air pollution and ambient air pollution in South Africa. And it's because there's that close team work between Mike and others in his team and our researchers that we are able to believe in what we're putting together. So when that ultimately gets presented to our national department or at provincial level, things make sense. And they have trust. And I think those are 2 very important things. You know, if it doesn't make sense, it's very difficult to want to take up and implement in decision making.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask the other speakers to turn on their cameras, and we'll engage them in a little bit of discussion with this next question. And I actually would like to just follow up on Dr. Wright's commentary about the importance of really local engagement and collaboration. And I think Aaron and Javin and Marcus, you all have some experience in that arena as well, having produced very complicated analyses. How do you engage local decision makers and local scientists in the research to the level that they can gain some trust and confidence in the results? And take anybody who would like to start with that question. Maybe I'll go ahead and call on Aaron. Do you want to take a stab at that? You mentioned making your results available and the efforts that you're taking on that.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a great question and a great point. And I think ultimately, so we were focused on kind of this like broad global picture of dominant sources, but we were trying to get down to at least more subnational scales to try to address some of the dominant sources. But yeah, I mean, I think action can happen at a lot of different scales, all the way from local governments up to federal governments and international negotiation space as well. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of work that we could and have not done on our particular GBD Maps project to engage with local communities. But I think a lot of that starts with just talking to the actual decision makers, figuring out who the decision makers are, who the key players are. And I think just trying to form relationships, like Carity was mentioning, building trust is really important. And so making the information, not only making the information available, but actually trying to do outreach with decision makers and start building those relationships. And I'm not saying we have done that with our study, but I think that would be an important next step. Yeah, so I'll stop there and let others answer.
Thank you, Aaron.
I can chime in on this. Yeah, while I agree that making these sorts of tools available on a website globally is really nice for increasing people's awareness of these issues and awareness of the tools. Yeah, as Carity mentioned, getting actual use of these tools in their own policy settings, it requires a lot more local engagement, buy-in. They want to feel like they have some skin in the game. A lot of times it's about seeing their data being used. So the extent to which these tools can incorporate not just satellite data, which is kind of nice from our research point of view, and being able to show this kind of tool to people all around the world, but local in situ measurements and being able to incorporate the data that they're often required to base their standards around in different parts of the world into these tools is a key part. I would also say a lot of these tools, people, not myself, but for example with LEAP IBC, they have folks who spend a lot of times running training sessions on how to run the tool, or just spending time working with folks in the countries or cities that are developing the capacity to apply these tools. I haven't been personally so much involved with that, but I know that, for example, in Accra, Chris Malley, who's has gone and spent a fair amount of time working with folks there on LEAP IBC implementation, and then folks from the Ghanaian EPA have visited Boulder to interface with a few different scientists here working on projects that are connected there. And so that kind of connection is definitely essential for some adoption and also improvement of these tools.
Thank you, Javin. Marcus, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe two aspects. One, just to confirm also my experience, I think it's first, when these global numbers, they're huge and they're hitting the headlines, but they're rather abstract and they don't tell much to people. So bringing it down to the specific neighborhood or the specific location where people are living is certainly in a very important way forward to inform or provide this information, which are the sources which are contributing, what are the impacts on your life, what are the sources contributing to this, and connected to this. I think the second aspect would be to systematically focus more on this issue, on the aspects where there are these conflicts in the society. When there And we're talking here about unless people are happy with the current pollution, then otherwise somebody should take some action. And then there's this blaming game starts immediately, that others should do something, I'm not doing something, and then different groups in the society, different economic sectors will necessarily come into conflict with each other. And providing information on these aspects, where are the conflicts, where are these difficult trade-off situations, also where policy needs to make some decision. I think this is, my experience is this is where attention is raising in the public area. If highlighting where are the conflicts, providing from the scientific side more objective information on what are the contributions from different sectors, sources, what are the cost-effective potentials for interventions, and feeding the information with this information, I think is an important way forward.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to a little bit more scientific technical question in terms of asking each of you to comment on where you think priorities should be for further research or additional information gathering to improve the quality and robustness of global estimates like the ones that Erin shared. I think topics that often come up or questions that often come up are in terms of emissions inventory quality, the amount of available data on the ground for concentrations, concentration response functions, of course, and the assumption that all of these PM 2.5 particles are equally toxic. So where would you prioritize efforts for moving forward from here? Erin, do you want to take a stab at that, and then we'll kind of go around the room?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I'm going to say that it depends on what your ultimate goal is, right? If you want to have the most accurate estimate of the attributable burden of disease, you should focus efforts on reducing uncertainties in concentration response relationships. If you're focused on identifying what the dominant sources of pollution are, and you're using these modeling methods, maybe you should focus more on reducing uncertainties in emission inventories or quantifying the uncertainties in the modeling approaches that you're using. And I had one other point and I lost it, so I will pause there and then we'll come back if I remember.
All right, thanks, Erin. Charity, let's turn to you for your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I have a small child in the background, sorry. I kind of feel like I'm looking back at that map where there was pretty much nothing being measured in Africa. And that really worries me. If we're going to go forward using satellite data to talk about air pollution in Africa, because we've got no ground-based data in Africa, except for a few countries, I don't think that makes sense. So then my question is, should we be advocating for ground-based reference high-grade scientific monitoring stations in African countries, or should we pursue low-cost sensors, something like that, or a combination of both, so that we can start to validate or consider how different the satellite data is to ground-based good or high cost, low cost on the African continent? So I suppose it's more of a question than an answer to your question.
Thank you. Questions are good answers in my mind. And Davin, do you want to take a turn at this question?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think Erin and Charity have already made excellent points. Maybe expanding on what Erin said in terms of wanting to have more information about the concentration response functions. To just be more specific about that, I think there's an interest in understanding more what these relationships look like at low concentration levels, and expanding our certainty there, as well as the very high levels, and incorporating the studies that examine those ranges of the scales, and how those studies are maybe different in different parts of the world, and when including different demographics, and being able to account for that variability in these sorts of estimates. That would be something that I definitely like to see. In my kind of world, in the modeling world, I would like to see some of these tools start to be able to represent nonlinear processes better. I think we have a lot of these tools making sort of linear estimates or providing some basis, and then people make a linear extrapolation from that. And Marcus, brings up the point that there's a lot of nonlinearities and leads to some very funny interpretations at times, not only in the atmospheric response but in the health response. And so I'm personally interested in tools that describe that better. And Charity's mention of the monitoring data, and I think I brought up this earlier, that we often encounter folks saying, okay, well, your tool is great, but how do I get my data into it? And in terms of should that be like a reference monitor, or should it be a distribution of cheap sensors? I mean, I feel like if you ask which would you get first, I mean, you're going to need to calibrate your cheap sensors with a reference monitor anyway. So if you just have the cheap sensors and only that, it would be a little hard. But certainly having something as a reference and then expanding from there with the cheaper sensors is a really cost-effective and scientifically exciting way to go.
Marcus, we'll give you a crack at this one as well.
Okay, yeah, I would, in terms of research priorities and from a global perspective, I would certainly align and support this question about enhancing the robustness of our understanding about the low-level concentrations, high-level concentrations, and about this, how certain are we about the linearity of the impacts in between, because there's really important implications on how you go about this. I would also put this on better understanding, enhancing the understanding of the importance of nature, about natural sources is really important in many parts of the world, especially there which are ranking high currently in all these total PM2.5 concentrations and resulting health impact calculations. But what do we know about the toxicity of natural sources? And then maybe one or two completely different directions. The first one is to have a better understanding about this socioeconomic, the embedding of all these health responses, health impacts in the socioeconomic setting. So the socioeconomic factors contributing to this, the different developing countries versus developed countries, different health conditions, health systems, and so on. How are they influencing the health impacts? And I think strategically also, this goes more maybe into social science also, about co-benefits. How would, health is one aspect, but of course there's this issue on global climate, other lifestyle factors influencing health, like personal lifestyles, and how could you suggest action or policy interventions which deliver these multiple benefits, not only on cleaner air, but on better health by maybe using less cars and more cycling or walking, or action which also is reducing greenhouse gas emissions or waste, so these aspects. So if we think about this sustainable development targets, which of the policy interventions would deliver clean air, but at the same time also make progress on the other dimensions?
I think those are all excellent points. The GBD maps effort is an impressive effort at integration, but thinking about even further integration that's needed to really understand the social context is really critical. So I think at this point we're supposed to break, and we'll pause for the HEI folks to sort of give a wrap up to our formal session, and then we're going to turn to an opportunity for Q&A with the panelists and the speakers. So I'll stop for just a second here.
Thank you very much, Jana. This has been a very wonderful discussion so far, and I know we've been getting lots of questions from people for all of our speakers and panelists. So we should just keep going. I wanted to quickly mention that we have our series of webinars continuing throughout the rest of May, throughout the rest of April, as well as May. So we hope you can continue to listen in and join the conversations as they happen. The next one's going to be on April 27th, and we'll focus on the COVID pandemic and air pollution. So sign up for that and we'll see you there. I'll hand it back to Jana and Eloise to keep going on the discussion. Thank you.
Eloise, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah. So just based on who's been upvoted. So this is a question that came in for Devon from Joanna Ferreira. And so this is a question about concentration response functions that consider outdoor concentrations, but in fact, people spend most of their time indoors, and ambient concentrations may not be representative of population exposure. And a sort of general request, could you comment on this?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. That's a great question. The concentration response functions are originally developed by relating, people showing up in hospital statistically to measured concentrations of ambient air pollution, and so they're accounting for, in that sense, the amount of time that people are exposed to ambient air. The concern then is when we apply that concentration response function to a different population whose relative time indoor versus outdoor, or their maybe indoor environment, is different than the population that was used in the EPI study to develop that relationship. And so, I wouldn't have a huge concern if we were talking about, okay, we're applying this just to the, the cohort of people that were used for developing this function in the US or China. But when we start to apply it to very different sorts of populations and very different sort of schedules for being indoor versus outdoor, it is a concern. The more information that we can get in terms of EPI studies, looking at this relationship across different populations, the more robust those relationships will be. But I would look very quizzically or skeptically, perhaps, at use of these tools in settings where we know there's been a massive shift in people's habits as far as their commute, their indoor versus outdoor exposure, even in the same populations that were used for this study. I would imagine you might see some estimates related to the impacts of COVID on air pollution and the impact of that on these sorts of estimates of premature deaths. And I would look very skeptically at that to say, to what extent were the patterns and habits during a COVID lockdown substantially different than they were during the time periods at which those EPI studies were done.
Thank you, Devin. I'm going to turn to a question for Aaron. This is from Chad Bailey and was also upvoted. When doing global modeling studies, how variable are the emissions inventory methods across nations? And how much disease burden is estimated to occur in areas of differing levels of quality of the emissions data?
Yeah, okay, so there is a wide variety of how you can estimate emissions. So with the inventory that we ended up using, the SEDS emission inventory, this is a really great tool in my opinion, because it uses information from various emission sources. So for example, they provide, or the first step in the SEDS system is to provide default estimates using kind of consistent methods around all regions in the world. But then it actually incorporates emission estimates from the US, for example, from the EPA, or for various agencies in the UK or Europe. And so the emissions that are used, or the final emissions in the SEDS system, kind of reflect these other more authoritative emission inventories. So that is one of the reasons, or another reason why we use the SEDS system. That being said, there are definitely areas of the world where emissions are more uncertain. I think Africa is definitely one of those regions. And I mean, you saw that there were multiple African countries that showed up kind of in that top 9 list that I showed at the end. And so there are large sources in large uncertainties in emissions in regions where the disease burden is quite large. So I think this is definitely one area that requires future work. It can be difficult collecting emissions information or information that you need to inform emission estimates. So activity data, emission factors for particular sources, how those data vary across countries or across regions. So this is an area that needs more attention, I think, but we in our study were using what we determined or what we thought were like the best available data at the time.
Thanks, Erin. There's a question for Marcus from Erin Cohen, and it's a rather weighty question. So is the choice between a cost effectiveness and cost benefit framework a political one? And what are the political economic priorities that underlie a government's preference for each approach? How does the choice between them affect disparities and inequities in outcomes within and between countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I think in principle, a way forward is to walk with 2 legs and to employ use both, take information from both types of analysis, as a cost effectiveness and a cost benefit analysis. For the cost benefit analysis, as I've mentioned, you need, in order to be accepted, people have to accept both the quantification of the health impacts as well as the quantification of the value of human life and so on, which is not always given, especially in a situation where decisions about the burdens, the inequalities and impacts, decisions which have impact on the distributional issues between in the sectors and between countries, if they are affected. But I think in principle, one issue of with the cost benefit analysis is that in principle this is a kind of a closed circle, and so you estimate the costs, you estimate the benefits, and then the method tells you one single solution, and this is the single solution coming out from the model machinery. And essentially, there's no place for a decision maker to do any decision, because the cost benefit analysis tells you the one and only decision which is the right one. A cost effectiveness analysis starts from policy targets which are chosen by decision makers, and then identifies, okay, if this is the target, then this and this and this set of measures is the most cost-effective way forward to achieve this target. And there's, of course, in the way you're specifying the target is already a lot of flexibility and opening for considering the distributional aspects of certain policies. And so this cost-effectiveness analysis would not or will not tell you one single answer, but usually it's kind of an iterative process where targets are established, the implications in terms of the distribution of costs and of benefits for the different groups in the societies are analyzed, discussed, and then in reality then maybe the targets will be modified, and it's an iterative process. And I think the way forward is to derive information from both sides of from both methods actually, and then at the end of the day, it's always a political decision with many other factors which we can never introduce in all the models, about political weight and preferences and all kinds of things. It's always a political decision, but I think what is really would be important is to promote the knowledge base and the scientific understanding as much as possible and bring it as close as possible to the decision process. And I see these 2 different ways or avenues for producing, for bringing a knowledge base into the decision process. And actually, it's a matter of taste. I think observe also it's a matter of a cultural issue, maybe in some parts of the world. Policy making is more used or more linked to cost benefits analysis, while in other parts of the world there's a very different culture there.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm going to turn to another question for Aaron. This one comes from Mikhail Krzyzanowski and was also upvoted. And he asks, what is a reason for the very large contribution of agriculture to global emissions? This appears to be something like 2 times larger than in earlier assessments.
Yeah, so agricultural sources of PM 2.5. So that's largely due to the emissions of ammonia that can go on to form ammonium nitrate particulate matter. And in terms of relative contributions, I think in our GBD Maps global study, we actually found a smaller relative contribution of agriculture than prior studies like the Lelyveld 2015 study that I showed on one of my earlier slides. So yeah, I guess I can't speak to there being a larger contribution now than in the past, because we actually found smaller contributions than some more recent study or previous studies.
So if I may, I think what stood out to me was the map showing agriculture as the largest sector for Europe. And I don't know if that's a different result, but maybe you could address that.
Yeah, no, that is something that stands out when you look at the maps. And no, I think that result is fairly consistent with what's been found in the past. And there are, I'm not going to remember the references at the moment, but there are a few studies that have looked at ammonia emissions specifically, focused in Europe and the US, and yeah, all found contributions of those emissions to particulate matter.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and not choose an upvoted question, because I think this question does also have relevance to sort of general representation of these health impact assessment studies. So this was directed to you, Devin. Helen McIntyre asks, or at least states, capturing population exposure can be a major challenge for such studies. What can we say about results from models with coarse grid spacing? How confident can we be in these health impact assessment results?
Yeah, that's a good question. Through studies where people have compared exposure estimates based on a fine resolution model to taking that model results and averaging it out over different scales, or using other models at different scales, we have some sense of what the uncertainty is as a function of the spatial scale of the model. And by the time you get to the resolution of a kind of classic global model, hundreds of kilometers of scale, then you're looking at uncertainty in the PM 2.5, long-term premature deaths on the order of about 30%. It's a little bit higher for the short-lived components if you look specifically at black carbon, and lower for the secondary components like sulfate. And then ozone, the uncertainty at those scales is much smaller, a few percent, again, because of the lifetime of ozone and the spatial scales of ozone episodes when considered at the time scales that they're included for the health impacts in the long-term average. That being said, people can still make efforts to try to reduce that uncertainty when applying global models within these health impact tools by downscaling or direct use of finer resolution data. I know in some of the tools that I've helped develop, we use the remote sensing based estimates of PM 2.5 at the 0.1 or 0.01 degree scale, so the kind of down to the kilometer scale, and apply that to our model, either in an absolute sense if we're making estimates for the present day in a year where we have the satellite data, or in a relative sense if we're talking about estimates 10, 30 years, 50 years in the future, which sort of allow us to rescale our model result to say, oh, here's this big grid box, and then yeah, Seoul is in one corner of it, but the rest of it is not part of the city. Well, we can sort of say, well, 90% of the PM is actually over here where that city is, and that's not going to change 30, 50 years from now. And so that kind of information can help reduce that source of uncertainty.
So I have a question for Charity. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the efforts that you see ongoing on the ground in South Africa to get low-cost sensors or other monitors deployed, and to build that data set?
Yeah, sure. So it's a good question because I'm part of a project with the University of Leicester in the UK. It's leveraging air quality data for epidemiological studies. Its abbreviation is LEAP-EPI. And as part of that project, we are doing a low-cost sensor co-location into comparison campaign to assess sensors that are both available in South Africa, but also from Kenya, working with Andriana Mbandi, and some sensors from the UK. So our first step there has really been to try and find sensors that are affordable. Low cost doesn't always mean low cost. And so that's been really, really tricky. Getting the sensors here, the campaign has been running now for a few weeks, and I'm trying to work out whether it's going to make sense to use these sensors, and whether if in some way we need to correct them or fix them or whatever, because when we run our, and I'm a public health scientist with an atmospheric science background, so I'm really coming from an exposure assessment perspective, and if we're going to want to understand exposure better, the use of low-cost sensors makes sense. And we need to know which ones are going to work best to do that. The other thing about low-cost sensors at the moment is, and I know this has been going on in Kenya, but I foresee it happening here in South Africa as well, is rightly so, where Erin showed the beautiful plots of our coal-reliant energy economy in South Africa. We have an area, a hotspot area, where air pollution is an enormous problem. In fact, NGOs and local residents have taken the president to the Constitutional Court for the right to clean air having been breached. And the desire to have more data, and not only data that's from government stations, but citizen science data, which raises all of its own questions. But wanting data that can be used to advocate for change.
I'm not sure how much more time we have for questions. I know there's one that I suppose selfishly interests me because there's so much focus on the transport sector. So this is from Saif Shukrak. And they ask, if you notice, you can clearly see that the transport sector only contributes 10 to 15% in each of the countries. So this was directed to you, Erin. But there is so much policy focus on this. What about the other 85%? And I don't, if others do want to chime in from the panel, they're welcome to as well.
Yeah, I'll just start really quickly. Yes, transportation receives a lot of attention, and I think on the global scale, it's a relatively small source, but just in the subnational variation that I showed in one of the maps in my talk, you saw that, like, at least in the US, like, transportation was the dominant source relative to all the other source categories in parts of the US. So it is relatively the most important compared to all of those other sources in particular locations. And if you want to get back to the discussion of co-benefits, I mean, the transportation sector is still the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the US. And so I think that alone warrants continued attention on this sector.
Yeah, I would, if I can add to this, I think it's really important to understand. It's a very good point raised in the question. Erin, you're completely right. In the US and also partly in Europe, transport is a really important source. But I think one has to be extremely cautious in transferring this information, this fact, to other parts in the world, where transportation maybe adds the same amount in absolute terms, but then there are so many other sources which do not exist in the US or in Europe, where we have the most of the studies. And I think this is exactly to the point raised in the question. So you have a certain contribution from the transport, which is much more than zero. But in some places, and especially in the high polluted places, the majority comes then from other sources which are not important in the Western world, but which make huge contributions and also are sometimes relatively cheap to control. and also deliver a lot of other co-benefits on development and other things. So I think one should not be mistaken by some source apportionments and the relative share of source apportionment in industrialized countries when one is looking into developing countries, because there is a huge potential by sources which don't exist in the Western world, and which, to my mind, when we think about cost effectiveness, would be the prime source for spending money, because the benefits coming, or the improvements you can reach with these other sources are maybe 10 times or 20 times larger than with what you achieve with the same money spent on transport sources. So it's really important to keep the site-specific conditions in focus, and then design the response strategy for the specific situation, and not transfer this from studies in other parts of the world with very different conditions.
I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to target this to Javin, but others feel free to chime in as well. The question is what physical data is captured by the satellite as part of remote sensing data for PM 2.5 estimates? And I'd like to broaden that just a little bit to see if you could comment on the geographic coverage of satellite observations at this point, and how they support efforts like GBD maps.
Sure. So, well, physically, satellites are measuring aerosol optical depth, which is this integrated quantity related to how much light is either absorbed or reflected by all the particles between the surface of the Earth and the top of the atmosphere. And this can then be impacted by what's happening at the surface, as well as aerosols that are sort of blowing by and transported quite some distances. And so these relationships are often more robust in terms of a long-term average sense, in terms of reflecting what's happening at the surface and what's consistently driven by sources at the surface. Although in some parts of the world where we have enough in situ measurements, we can learn either through sort of machine learning or other sort of statistical approaches how this relates to surface concentrations at a much higher time resolution. But that requires a fair amount of in situ measurement to constrain. We will have satellite measurements that will give more insight into composition of the PM in the future, but at the moment, a lot of what we know is more about sort of the overall mass. That's because a lot of these satellites are, they're just measuring AOD, and they're trying to map out AOD globally, and they're making measurements across a few different platforms, maybe a few times a day on the global scales. But more recently, we do have geostationary instruments that can measure AOD on an hourly basis over North America and over East Asia, and this will be more common in different sub regions of the world in the coming decade. This will help us understand their sources and I think maybe some of the exposure questions in new ways. And I think their value, in addition to the sort of spatial coverage, is the long-term trends and the long-term record that we have from remote sensing data. And I think Aaron's work really touches on this a lot. And when you look at sort of changes across years and even decades, people can piece together records from different remote sensing instruments going back quite some time, and align this with the sort of long-term historical data on emissions, and see what the connection is between policies that people have enacted and sort of the large-scale response of the atmosphere. And so that's been a big, a really nice benefit of these sorts of measurement.
I think we are out of time. I know there were many more questions that came in even just as a result of this Q&A session, so we should close out. I wasn't sure if Pallavi wanted to have the final closing statement.
Yes, Thank you, Eloise, and thank you to all of the speakers and the panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think we still have many more questions yet to discuss and answer. So hopefully we can follow up with other sessions on this topic. We're very excited also that the people got a preview of the GBD Maps report and how it might be used in different places. We are hoping to work with Erin and the other investigators on the team to continue that conversation. So stay tuned for more on that. On HEI's behalf, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today, both our chairs, the speakers, the panelists, as well as audience members. As we've said before, recordings are going to be available on YouTube in the coming weeks. Please stay tuned for more information on that. And our next webinar is going to focus on the COVID pandemic and links with air pollution and health. And again, on behalf of everyone at HEI, I would like to thank you all. And we're hoping that you can fill our post-webinar survey so we can continue these webinars and conversations in the future. Thank you very much.